Welcome to Second Life, a popular virtual world game launched back in June 2003 and throughout the rest of the 2000s would shape the concept of the metaverse and what it is today. Many consider it a product ahead of its time for encompassing the idea of a virtual world that one can partake in similar to modern day VR chat, and in the process will be played by millions of people online even to this day. However, with every video game there are bound to be trolls and griefers ruining everyone's fun, and so one day a single man decided to take things into his own hands to combat the issue, but in the process would become the very thing he sought out to destroy. Meet Second Life user Kal-El Venkman, better known by his real name Gene Turnbow. Now Gene here is currently 69 years old and was an early player of Second Life back in the mid-2000s when it really blew up online and when he was in his early 50s. He enjoyed the game for what it was and how it mimicked a lot of real life in this virtual world, but the one thing he didn't like were trolls and griefers. Now obviously y'all know what trolls are, and before the term came commonplace, people used to use the term griefers to describe these people. They're one and the same in just two different phrases to explain the same kinds of people, and so Gene would get immensely frustrated having to deal with their antics while playing the game as a 50-year-old man who just wanted to blow off some steam in his free time. The same can be said for 67-year-old Kara Tim Tam, better known by her real name Susan Fox Davis. Just like Gene, she too would get annoyed at having to deal with all these griefers and trolls during her time playing the game, and for a while they would put up with it as it was just part of the experience at the time. However, one day they would come across each other and learn that they share the same grievances at one another, in which they came to realize that somebody needs to put a stop to everything once and for all. This would lead to the creation of Justice League Unlimited on April 6, 2006, a group of people started by the two and another friend of theirs named the Spearman, and a group led by Gene that went around Second Life reporting any trolling and griefing activity to Linden Labs, the creators of the game. The thing that made them stand out was that they would wear avatars of various DC comic characters in the game so that players knew who they were the moment they saw them, and also feeding into the sense of protecting the players as they sought out to do by acting and looking like an authority figure. It was also part of feeding into Gene's sense of superiority over others, as the dude had already named himself Kal-El in the game, the real name of Superman, and when creating a username in Second Life you can only make up your first part as the last name is picked from a list, showing that this man has a big ego going on here. In a 2007 article written about them on popular Second Life news site the Alphaville Herald, Gene would open up about the creation of the JLU, saying, quote, "It was going to be an RP group, but after about 3 weeks of us walking around dressed as superheroes, people started coming up to ask for help with various problems, griefers in particular. So, we had two choices, drop back or step up. We stepped up. We've been a public service organization ever since. Since that time, about 14 months ago, we've grown to nearly 70 members. They would become a notorious vigilante group in Second Life, as though some people don't mind them going around playing policeman. Others would get immensely annoyed as to them. This was all just a video game and they found it rather stupid and childish. Some 40-plus-year-old people are threatening to report and similar stuff over mild in-game grievances. One thing that I need to point out here is that Second Life has had this identity crisis, if you must, where some people view it as just a game, but others view it as a literal Second Life in a virtual world. The vastly different perceptions going on here is what leads to a lot of conflict even to this very day, as to some people bringing out your gun and shooting it around in the air is just video game goofing off, whereas to others they treat it super seriously and as if you actually just brought out a gun and started shooting around in real life. In an ironic way, it's part of what makes Second Life, and is also part of the experience. And in Gene's case, he and the others running JLU clearly treated the game as this super serious world that needs people to keep order among the citizens within. However, we still have that polar opposite side of people who view the game as just any other place to goof off around in. And in turn, there's a particular group of trolls that made a name for themselves throughout the game. Say hello to Patriotic Nigras, a troll group known within the Second Life universe. Now some of y'all might recognize that rather dapper and civilized man in a suit on the left over there, and it turns out that this group was behind one of the internet's most infamous trolling escapades of all time. Sometime in 2005, members of the 4chan/B board decided to raid the video game Habbo Hotel for shits and giggles. This would be immensely funny to them, and so they pull off a new raid in July 2006, blocking access to the virtual pool dressed as black men with large afros and Armani suits and telling the users that the pool is closed due to AIDS. In typical 4chan fashion, they would start to get edgy with it for shock value and easy laughs among the members, and in turn would not only pull off one of the greatest video game raids of all time, but also cement themselves in internet lore for the rest of eternity. They can be their own video topic entirely if I'm being honest, but after the Habbo Hotel raids, most onlookers would move on as it seemed their reign of terror among the innocent video game crowd was over. Except this wasn't the end of them, as after the July 2006 raid they'd move on to their next target, Second Life. Now they had technically already been trolling them a small bit before the Habbo Hotel raid, but it was after that was over that PM was able to move on to the game entirely, with many members making accounts on the game to cause chaos for their own shits and giggles. This would usually range from basic name calling to their most known form of trolling, particle spamming, in which they would spam thousands upon thousands of the same images to crash servers and computers as they basked in glory. They would particularly raid a handful of furry-themed worlds known as Fur Nation as well, and in turn would very quickly become a known troll group within Second Life and its user base. In fact, they were the sole reason that Gene made JLU to begin with, as he deemed these people a threat to the game and therefore wanted them gone by any means necessary. And so this beef between PN and JLU would be a reoccurring theme throughout both their existences in Second Life. Now, as we know, PN wasn't exactly the best group of people, and something that they would do would happen to be doxing, but to be a little bit fair, back in the day it wasn't treated with as much scrutiny as today. For a while, they were simply just tolerated by Linden Labs as another group to keep an eye on and nothing more, as a majority of their trolling was just really annoying, but to Gene and the rest of JLU, they were a massive threat so big that they would spam report anyone who they thought was even a part of the group to get them banned off the game. This overzealous approach to their vigilantism and trying to police the game would get them banned from Fur Nation, ironically enough, and add that alongside Gene's lack of understanding 4chan culture and deeming anyone who ever used the site as a threat, he would conflate everyday 4chaners who played the game as PN members and would also spam report them as well despite them not even being part of the group. Eventually, after trashing up the Second Life world of US politician John Edwards in February 2007, only then would Linden Labs step in and start to ban PN members left and right as the mainstream media was now looking at the game in a negative light. This would lead to many bans, in which PN would circumvent using their own modded client called Shooped Life to bypass many of the hardware banning methods the Lindens had in place. This new war between PN and the Lindens led to them forming a close connection to JLU, as Gene had wanted them gone since the very beginning, in which he and other members would have direct connections to the Lindens in their efforts to rid the game of PN entirely. However, for the most part, it would still be fruitless, as one of the many trolling escapades that PN participated in was the Sand Chicken incident, in which after a new craze involving breeding colorful chickens would grow out of control as there were so many it would cause servers to lag, they would join in and start killing them just for shits and giggles, much to the owner's dismay.
So what was happening with biowarfare was that other Second Life users were just trying to kill the chicken plague to take back their servers. Well, of course, the chicken owners were pissed off about this because it's their private property. And once a band of griefers from Woodbury College figured out that people were pissed about chicken killing, they just started killing them just to get a reaction. And once another group of people figured out that Woodbury College was targeting chickens, they started buying chickens just to get them killed by Woodbury College so they could complain to Linden Lab, who runs Second Life, right?
That group who was buying chickens so they could then complain about PN killing them was JLU from what I've gathered, meaning that this whole beef, while still pretty entertaining, was getting to a very insane point of obsessiveness. I see why Gene doesn't like PN, but it seemed that at every front he and the JLU were looking for any reason to go at him for anything and everything they could find out about him. Also, some place called Woodbury College was mentioned in that clip, and let's just say that Woodbury is its own story entirely in this ongoing war between PN and JLU, and one that would show just how much power the JLU had during their time running around the metaverse back in the day. To make a long story short, Woodbury University was a location in Second Life funded by the real-life Californian college, aptly named Woodbury University. It was started in 2006 by the college itself as a fun little class project and nothing more, with them spending $1,750 for the land in the game and paying a monthly fee to keep it up. The owner of Woodbury was a student named Tizzers Foxchase, better known online these days as simply Tizzy, and for a while it was nothing more than a virtually dead world as it was mainly just a hangout spot for her and her friends. Early photos of the place certainly show that too, as you can see right on screen now, and so the place would sit mostly dormant as just another random Second Life world with nothing notable going on or worth going into outside of her small friend group. While Woodbury was doing its own thing, the Patriotic Nigras are still on their troll shit, and most importantly, they were looking for a permanent home for their group. You see, despite being trolls, they were still active players of the game, and so a reoccurring thing that would happen was alongside getting their accounts banned, they would also get their homes deleted as well. They would call these various homes Fort Longcat, and in fact, the very first iteration was outside a furry nightclub in the game where they set up camps so they could troll them until it got deleted. You have many iterations of Fort Longcat such as Castle Longcat, Desert Longcat and only surviving photo being of this one on the inside, and Epic Fort Longcat, one of the most infamous and well documented of the bunch. There's even a surviving video of the SS Longcat and someone traveling about through that iteration, showing that they weren't sticking to just forts throughout their time online. The point here is that with every new iteration of Fort Longcat, the Lindens would delete them and cause the members of PN to scatter about as they look for their next place to live, and it just so happened they found one that suited them the most. While Woodbury was pretty dead for a while, one of Tizzer's friends named Darth Blue Afro would start to invite their 4chan friends into the world that same 2006 year, in which PN would take notice seeing their fellow channers inhabit the place and ask Tizzers if they could make it their next home. She would accept them as she was well aware of 4chan culture and supported the counterculture identity the site represented, and so they would go on to take up part of Woodbury and build the Woodbury iteration of Fort Longcat in the process as they finally found themselves a new home. For the next couple months, PM would stand strong as the Lindens either never found out they were living in Woodbury, or never cared to do anything so long as they weren't doing stuff that needed them to step in to stop. Tizzers was happy that not only was Woodbury thriving, it was her own kind that was inhabiting the place as well, even if she wasn't ever a member of PN. And overall, every side of the matter seemed to be content with how things were going now. Well, that is except for Justice League Unlimited over there. As to them, seeing that PM was still around meant their work wasn't done yet, and so Gene and his crew would plan their next attack in this ongoing war to rid Second Life of PN once and for all. After JLU learned that PM was now living in Woodbury, they would spam report Linden Labs and tell them that Woodbury was a troll headquarter and harboring the group to get them banned, and on April 12, 2007, this would lead to a 3-day suspension of the site in the process. This would piss off Tizzers and the rest of Woodbury, but they would move on from it as it was just a 3-day suspension and nothing really big at the time. However, this would all change in just a few short months, and in turn lead things down a much more serious path. In June 2007, just 2 months after the suspension, Linden Labs would email the real Woodbury University directly and say that they're shutting the place down and banning all players due to having problems stemming from that location and breaking TOS. It turns out that a member of Woodbury named Maldavius Figtree would trash the place up and cause a whole lot of chaos himself, in which just 2 weeks later the Lindens would step in and end not only yet another iteration of Fort Longcat, but the entire Woodbury University sim in the process. Now I'm sure some of y'all know who Maldavius Figtree is by now, but if you don't know, he's the infamous video game streamer Pirate Software, who these days is mostly known to the public as an extremely toxic and very manipulative individual. And so over a decade and a half later, people'd see that he was the one who got Woodbury banned and started trashing him for it. However, given how old and rather undocumented all this information is, I decided to hit up Tizzers herself so she could give me some insight on his involvement in the downfall. She would tell me he was a pretty chill guy and was one of the original moderators of Woodbury in early 2007, even helping script a whole submarine for users of the world to play around with in their free time. She would say how they met up in real life a few times and even gave him a tour of the real Woodbury, but most importantly would say how she and the other members had already planned on wiping Woodbury down to the ground and starting fresh before he trashed the place up. So, this means that Pirate Software wasn't this heinous person who trashed a random place up because he was being mean. He was a mod of the site who decided to do some trolling himself before they enacted their plan to rebuild anew. Except, after doing his trolling, they were never able to rebuild as planned. As the Lindens saw this, it must have seen it as PN acting out, and in their eyes, they thought PN was basically running the place and decided to just nuke it altogether. On top of that, Pirate Software was also part of JLU for around 2 months as he would join them in April 2007, and it was right after they saw him trash a Woodbury that he would be kicked out, as in their eyes he was also a troll and they wanted nothing to do with him from that point onwards. Of course, he had his hands in the cookie jar while he was with the group for a short period of time, such as creating the Echelon Griefer tracking system, a tool where after putting a couple lines of code into weapon caches he would leave in PN bases, whenever a PN member would pick up a gun and shoot it, he would immediately receive messages to a cube located under his in-game bed so he could relay the info to the JLU headquarters and they could kick into action. It became useless early on as PN members would just start to create their own weapons, but it seemed that Pirate Software had a lot more hands-on experience with both the JLU and PN during his time playing the game. Some old message leaks would show Pirate Software admitting that he's trolled PN, JLU, and some other people, showing that his main reason of trolling in the game was to simply entertain himself by means of causing chaos. So in a weird twist, he wasn't this outright evil person in Second Life, he was just a guy who did some trolling and pissed off a lot of people in the game due to choosing no side except his own, and in the case of Woodbury, trashed the place up before they enacted their plan to rebuild. It's just that the Lindens nuked the place entirely so that plan never came to fruition, and his reputation from that point onwards was seen in an awful light because of his attitude and antics in the game. Now after Woodbury was deleted and interviews were had with an actual university professor about the situation, stuff would still keep up on Tizzer's side of things. Pirate Software would move on and focus on his own stuff, and Tizzers would take a page from PN and created a new account in various Woodbury hideouts with the help of Inteliber Brodigan, a user who owned a real estate company in Second Life called Brodigan and Tuck Holdings that gave her the land to use, and also someone who happened to work with Pirate Software as well until he fired him after being a headache to deal with. This would start soon after Woodbury's deletion, and she would treat it like a place for members to have a home similar to how the Fort Longcats worked, even adding her own Longcats to the mix as a cheeky reference to the group. This will go on for a while before finding a new home in a 2008 iteration named Woodbury 3.0, before moving on to a brand new piece of land in 2010 and naming it Soviet Woodbury after people kept calling him communist and thought it'd be pretty funny to theme it as such. However, on April 20th, 2010, this new iteration of Woodbury University would be deleted a second time off the game, this time because of Linden Labs and the real college having conflicting ideas on what a virtual campus should look like, with Woodbury itself open to the freedom of creation whereas Linden wanted it to look like a real campus. This would be the end of Woodbury and Second Life as we know it, and Tizzers would move on to brighter pastures as there was no chance she or the college could get things rolling ever again. Meanwhile, PN was still doing their own thing, as despite being scattered about and not really having a home ever again in the world of Second Life, they still did some trolling even as leader after leader kept hemorrhaging and moving on in life. On New Year's Day 2009, 3 members would recreate the JLU headquarters in a new world and trash it up to make it seem as if they got into the real headquarters for shits and giggles. It was a pretty tame trolling attempt, all things considered, but by this point in time the group was all but done for, and by 2010 they ceased to be active ever again, with just their website remaining as of today and reminding those of the good old days. It seemed that this was the end of an era and that the JLU won this war, but things were about to change as even though they defeated PN once and for all, they pissed off a whole new group of people in Woodbury in their lust for vengeance, and those people had unfinished business with them for ruining their world almost 3 years ago. Now just 2 months after the original Woodbury University was deleted, a member of Justice League Unlimited named Nicola Shirokawa would cut ties with them and whistleblow the secret stuff they do behind the scenes to the Alphaville Herald in August 2007. It would start off saying that the JLU has this bot connected to their avatars called the Brainiac device, in which whenever they were wearing it around people it'd run a script on every single person to get their data, including Linden Labs devs themselves. It's already very weird that they're compiling this info on the users in the game, and the reason is because if they think you're part of Patriotic Nigras or are a general troll, they'd make a whole entry on what was called their Brainiac wiki of whoever they were going after. This includes docs and info like their real name, address, phone numbers, ISPs, and pictures, and in specific, Nicola would bring up that they have the docs and info on PN leader Moody Kips and another member named Nexus. JLU would justify this saying that PN has the docs info on Kara Timtam aka Susan, and Gene had apparently confessed to harassing Nexus's provider Verizon in order to get him kicked off the internet, even going as far as to have people stalk PN chat rooms and Skype group chats in order to keep tabs on them. As part of the bot compiling info on those they came across in the game, they'd also write specific entries for the developers they felt were most susceptible to giving into their demands, basically meaning if they started a mass report campaign they would hit up specific developers in order to manipulate them into their bidding knowing that they would give in easier. Also, in between Woodbury's 3-day suspension to their first ban in the game back in June that year, JLU would contact one of those susceptible devs named Michael Francis to get it banned and start to stalk players at alt accounts, and no doubt likely compile docs and info on every player in Woodbury as well until its eventual destruction. That begs a question, however. Even though the devs banned it after Pirate Software trashed the place up, could it have just been the devs finally having a reason to get rid of the place and stop the pestering of the JLU? Or better yet, were the devs directly colluding with JLU and were just waiting for a reason to step in themselves? Either way, it was clear that JLU wasn't this nerdy wannabe police force in a video game, but an actual threat that had connections to the devs and therefore had a lot of power and were not afraid to abuse it, even if it came down to doxing those they didn't like. Gene wouldn't like that this news was being exposed to the public and would start to immediately deny and downplay Nicola's expose, dropping Moody Kip's apparent real name in his attempt to prove they were just doing the right thing, indirectly also showing he did indeed dox him given he's using his name as a form of intimidation and leverage. He would go on about other stuff and Nicola would respond back saying how he has his photograph on his wiki entry as well as having one for Tizzers who wasn't even part of PN, and they would kinda get into a pissing match on who's the worst person and such that isn't too important. However, Gene would actually confirm they did indeed kick out Pirate Software because of him trashing up Woodbury for anybody wondering what the reason was. And Tizzers has gone on to tell me that he never even knew the Brainiac device was a thing during his time with them, and given she answered other general questions I already knew the answers to correctly when asking, I'll take her word on that one. Now after this news broke, things would start to fall apart in the JLU's side of things. Gene would deem a similar group named Green Lantern Corps hostile because they were still friendly with Nicola, and also because Tizzers apparently raided his house in real life and they were okay with that. It turns out this wasn't a raid, but it was actually Halloween and Tizzers thought it would be funny to trick-or-treat at his place given she was still a teenager at the time and knew where he lived, in which she would get banned off the game for 2 weeks in the process. Now granted, it's pretty weird to get someone's address and go to their place in any context, but in her defense, this was the old internet where this kind of stuff wasn't shunned upon like it is today, so do keep that in mind. Plus, it also doesn't help that despite trying to play victim to this so-called raid, it would leak out that not only was Gene not home when it happened, but he would say that if he was home, he would have killed her and her friends, showing that he's clearly the more deranged one here. Oh yeah, and he also contacted the real Woodbury University where she was going to school at to try and get her kicked out as well, just thought to point that out before we moved on here. Now even though Nicola whistleblew all this information about the Brainiac wiki to the public, Gene and the JLU would simply deny its existence or heavily downplay its capabilities and what they were doing with it. After all, Nicola didn't provide any hard proof but rather just her word, and for the next couple years any posts made on the Alphaville Herald talking about JLU or PN would immediately lead to arguments between the commenters. A new anonymous group named Witness X would start to stir the pot as well, with many people pretending to be them in order to just talk mad shit for their own laughs. It was even said that Pirate Software might have been one of the many people who used the moniker at one point in time, but Tizzers would tell me that it was a meme to say anyone was Witness X for easy laughs between one another, so it's very extremely unlikely he ever used the name in his life. I wanted to point that part out now, because in that same post when Nicola whistle blew what the JLU was doing with the Brainiac device, an anonymous Witness X user would straight up dox her in the comments and reveal her to be a transgender female in the process. This compromised her safety and showed that whoever was behind this didn't like that she was talking about this information, and another Witness X user from another article would reveal that she also had issues with plans to game end herself, showing that her mental state was not in the best spot in her life. Even after dropping the Nicola Shirakawa identity altogether at the beginning of 2009 and going by the new name of Miley Stewart, this wasn't enough for her to get through her issues in life, and later on her 22nd birthday she'd make a successful attempt on her own life. This on top of the Brainiac Wiki revelation caused JLU to lose a lot of public favor, and in turn, they had gone from a group of overzealous wannabe internet police who wanted to make the game better even if they were annoying, to a group with a lot of power and willing to do whatever it takes to get their way and control everything around them. However, things still weren't over, as even though the public now viewed them in a bad light, they still didn't know just how deep the Brainiac Wiki actually went, and so some people started to think about what they could do to finally get some answers as to just how much information they had stored. Even though Tizzers and the rest of the Woodbury members are going around making a new home in the world of Second Life, she was still pretty pissed off that Jean wasn't facing any justice for the Brainiac leaks coming to light, and add that alongside how he contacted her college to get her kicked out of school, she had a bone to pick with the man. She, her friend Haruhi Thespian, and a handful of others would create the group The Wrong Hands in late December 2009 after a Justice League Unlimited member came to them and provided 3 screenshots of the contents within proving its existence. After seeing the lengths they were willing to go to get docs and information on people, they would hatch up a plan to infiltrate the JLU and leak the entire contents of the wiki for the world to see. The plan would be pretty simple: make a new Second Life account and get on the good side of Jean so that they could get access to the site. I would normally say this is easier said than done and go into all the details on how they were able to pull it off, but this is literally how it went down. Haruhi made their account and got on Jean's good side within days after meeting him come New Year 2010. He would give her a tour of Justice Island that all the members hang out around in their free time, and at one point he almost figured her out after seeing how she was the perfect recruit for their group and how it felt odd to him, but she would play it off smoothly and continue to become acquainted with the members. You can even see how he expects Woodbury members to act exactly like her, showing just how on the nose he was before she somehow managed to play it off. That's how close her cover was almost blown. She would eventually be given access to the Brainiac Wiki just 4 days into gaining Jean's trust, and well, I think you know where this story is heading now. On January 10th, 2010, Haruhi would be patiently waiting to chime in during a meeting at the Table of Justice, in which she would say, "We at Woodbury are thankful for the wiki," before peacing out from the group entirely. Susan would respond confused as to what was going on, and just hours later an article in the Alphaville Herald would drop showing the entire wiki has been leaked for the public to see. It turns out this wiki didn't just have entries on a handful of Patriotic Nigras members. There were over 1,700 entries on pretty much anyone they came into contact with. The wiki itself is pretty interesting to dig through, as the main page shows a mass amount of general updates they were posting, and some of the more interesting posts pertain to them keeping up with PN members and whatever they were up to, such as the progress on their new custom client called Thug Life after the coder for Shoop Life moved on to brighter pastures. They would even have an entry for Pirate Software, in which they would say he was the only person they ever kicked out of the group, showing that his very infamous sour reputation throughout multiple gaming communities throughout his life might have started the very day he knocked down Woodbury. Now, I already said that the wiki has the doxes of various PN members or people affiliated with them, and trust me, it does. And so for very obvious reasons I won't get into that, but let me show you just how insane they were when it came to compiling information on anybody. Here's Whistler Spittler, a member of the Green Lantern Corps that Jean broke off with after they were cool with Nicola and Tizzers still. This guy, for all intents and purposes, is a nobody. He's not a threat to Jean or his gang in any sort of way, yet they have an entire write-up on him the very first day they learned of his existence and the groups he's a part of. They even have a separate wiki entry entirely for his alt account Red Lantern Republic, showing that they were keeping a very close eye on this guy for whatever reason they had. Mind you, the dude isn't even a troll, he's just like any other player, but unlike Jean and his crew, he wasn't deranged enough to gather up as much info on random people the way they were. He would just report someone who was breaking the rules. It gets even crazier, as when showing off a chat message of Tizzers talking about an account they borrowed from a friend called Azumanga, Jean or another editor would add a note stating that a Linden Labs employee named Plexus Linden actually looked into it and proved it was an alt of hers rather than borrowing it from a friend, meaning that Jean, other JLU members, and actual employees running the game were working together on compiling information on at least one person here. That means it's possible this had been going on for a while and they might have done it with more people, and most importantly, shows that Linden Labs had a lot more hands-on experience with JLU than it initially seemed. This exposure would mark the end of any remaining public goodwill the group might have still had and absolutely crippled and beyond repair. So Gene would start to DMCA any and all websites the leaks are being hosted on in his attempt to control the narrative. He would send emails to ISPs claiming that he owned everything on the wiki and that he was all doing this in the name of protecting the children, also saying that they were violating the law by not taking them off the site to some success and some other not so successful attempts, and would even start to falsely label known writer in Alphaville Breaking the News Pixely Mistral as a troll themselves despite them doing nothing of that in nature. In retaliation, they were going to reveal that JLU accounts for 1/6 of the entire reports that Linden Labs gets, meaning that for multiple years they had been spamming up their inboxes and quite possibly were the first successful group to use the tactic of spam reporting in the modern age to go after those they don't like. Gene would even go as far as to sending a DMCA to TypePad, the company that hosts Alphaville Herald, in order to get the information they posted talking about the leaks taken down. TypePad would end up removing mass amounts of information that Pixeline showed to the public about the leaks, and Pixeline would end up having his true identity as Mark McCahill revealed by the owner of the site Urizenis Sklar, who also had to reveal himself as Peter Ludlow in order to send a legal dispute back towards Gene's way so they could fight his DMCA claim. This would prove to be a success as after the 14-day response period ended, Gene would fail to file a copyright infringement claim in court and Peter was able to get everything back on the site for the world to see. The JLU was officially tarnished once these leaks came out, as the public now knew that the group was just as bad if not worse than the very people they sought out after in the name of protecting the citizens of Second Life. It wouldn't help that people had found out even more deranged stuff about the group, such as how they were stalking a PN member on his deathbed named Deadly Kodak on Facebook through his family's accounts to see when he would eventually die, releasing medical information on one of the people they were stalking in the forum much to someone's disgust, fabricating chat logs in an attempt to get someone banned, and even just straight up framing people to get to the same goal as well. That would all be compiled in August 2011, but by this point the vast majority of Second Life users knew they were a threat to the game, and so these same users would constantly ask Linden Labs to step in and put a stop to everything. Nonetheless, JLU would try to push through this and continue to play police in Second Life, but unfortunately for them, they would never have the same influence ever again, and by 2015 they were all but disbanded as everyone, even those with small ties to them like the Green Lantern Corps, had packed everything up and simply moved on with their lives. Given that this whole beef has been over for almost 2 decades now as of this upload, all parties mentioned throughout seem to have moved on to brighter pastures. Patriotic Nigras were dissolved by 2010 as people grew up, and I even contacted a former member who managed to make a pretty good career for themselves. Tizzers in the wrong hands would expose an online client called Emerald Viewer that was used to DDoS another website and get it banned off Second Life before the group broke apart due to interpersonal drama. She would come out as a transgender woman in 2013, and after making constant iterations of Woodbury Second Life throughout the 2010s, she would eventually move on to VR Chat, going on to run her very own VR Chat Discord server and world that is inhabited by thousands of unique users with similar identities like her own to this very day. After a failed rebrand in a League of Heroes, Gene would move on to focus on his website Krypton Radio, where he and others would make entries talking about various happenings in nerd culture. And in fact, it would become one of the more popular sites of that niche, so much that he would actually rebrand it to Sci-Fi Radio in 2021. He also divorced his ex-wife and got married to Susan Fox Davis in 2010 as well. And since then, the both of them have been running Sci-Fi Radio together to much success, making it their full-time careers by 2015. Honestly, even though each of these people had their issues with one another and all did their own bad things on various levels, they all seem to come out of it mostly unscathed and found happy endings for themselves. I know a lot of people still look back on Gene with a sour taste in their mouths, and rightly so. The dude was a massive control freak and asshole who stooped down to PN's level and even below in his attempts to police Second Life pretty much his entire time playing. Tizzers led a group she knew were seen in a controversial light into her world and got caught in a crossfire, and though thankfully she wasn't the one doxing unlike PN and JLU over there, she still showed up to Gene's house even if it was just a small trick-or-treat joke. However, for those that weren't around back then, doxing culture back in the day was a lot more relaxed as the threat of people getting majorly and negatively affected by it simply wasn't understood yet. Doxing each other in the early days was a form of normal if a bit pushing it trolling and shit-stirring, unlike how it's one of the worst things you can do today, and even at that, the absolute worst thing that would happen most of the time is somebody would order pizzas to your house. However, as the 2010s started to take off, the really bad trolls would start to take things to the next level, and that's how swatting became a thing. Suddenly people realized that doxing wasn't this basic intimidation tactic, but something that could lead to very bad consequences, and thankfully in today's world is seen as a very bad thing to do. I say all this because I honestly don't think any one of these people and groups mentioned are evil or unforgivable, and in fact as we saw, the people we explicitly talked about by name all made successful careers for themselves after getting out of this nasty cycle they got caught up in. They were just a product of their time and thankfully have moved on to brighter pastures, and I think that's a good thing at the end of the day here. As for Second Life itself, well, I know the game ain't in its heyday anymore, but it is still popular amongst older crowds, and as far as I know, they don't have a force like Justice League Unlimited running around and making life hell for whatever user they didn't like that day. It was obvious the devs colluded with JLU at some points in time, and I'm sure they were very embarrassed when it came out they were working with the nasty group for multiple years when the Brainiac WikiLeaks went down. I just find it bitterly ironic that in Gene's attempts to make Second Life a safer place and to rid the game of PN, he ended up turning JLU into a troll group themselves that was just as bad if not worse than their rival, and it's almost poetic in a way seeing the downfall is specifically because of this hubris going on. Shout out to my channel members for helping support my content, and shout out to my bestie tier members Wrath Wolin, Nami, Cody, Laura Hertzman, Cheems, Daniel, Mystical GB, Hyper aka V, and Trendy Dragon. Go check out my Patreon and YouTube memberships if you want to support me yourself in the description below, and I hope you join as soon as you can. Either way, the story of Justice League Unlimited is a story of old internet antics, old internet users, and old internet morals all wrapped together in what was a tumultuous time in the first successful metaverse-like video game title. All parties have moved on and made successful careers for themselves, and you know what? Given how most stories on the internet goes, especially on this channel, I'd say that's a good ending here if you ask me.